join us in the course of time, Shugufta and Naeem Ahmed Majur Sahib. Hello, Sahar Shah. How are you? Nice to see you again.
Thank you so much.
Irshad, how cold is it?
Yeah? If there's cold, you know this time in Kashmir.
Oh, I remember those winters.
you, you have seen the winters in city and also in village of Kashmir. So you know better.
10 years of it.
Yeah. At that time, we had much more snow. Slowly and gradually, snow has diminished, but I think this year also we had good snow. It has started. So let's start. I formally welcome you all to this today's webinar on the eve of International Human Rights Day. The subject for today's webinar is agonies of people of Jammu and Kashmir. As you're all very good friends of Kashmir, and some of you are Kashmiris, and you have suffered through all these things through these 3 decades long turmoil in Kashmir and the human rights violations which are being perpetrated there by the Indian forces. Unfortunately, the world is celebrating the Human Rights Day, and we have seen for the last so many years when this declaration was passed, we have seen a large number of human rights regime put in for the promotion and protection of human rights. But unfortunately, the people of Kashmir have yet to see the benefits of this regime and the benefits of this declaration or the covenant, which is the Bible of human rights. That's what we'll be discussing today. Without any further ado, making a long speech on the introduction, I will straight away go to Irshad, who is a journalist in Kashmir. Irshad is working with Kashmiri magazine Kashmiriyat, a budding journalist from Kashmir, and he has the first-hand information of Kashmir, and we will listen from Irshad first. Irshad, you have the floor.
Thank you very much for providing me a chance here. It's been a great pleasure and prestigious for me to have opportunity with you. And I would like to thank you, KIIR, and Dr. Shugufta, and particularly Dr. Rafiq Rathar for bestowing me a favorable chance here. So I do not know what to start, what to highlight, and what should not, because Kashmir is full of agonies and Kashmir is full of miseries. So I believe it's quite injustice for me to deliver my presentation, to speak what I have written and what I have to deliver to about you. But one thing is clear, but as the world is celebrating International Human Rights Day, in Kashmir, such rights have been missing, and we are not enjoying such rights. There is no doubt that the world is, there is no doubt that the world is enjoying such rights, and world is moving forward. And apart from this, I being the part of the conflict zone where there is no value of rights. I belong to the place where mothers are losing their sons. I belong to the place where everything has been snatched. So much has been written and much has been told about the values of Kashmir. But let me categorically tell you that after the abrogation of Article 317 and 35A, the Kashmiri has lost its identity. And what international community has to do, it has adopted a callous attitude. It has not shown any kind of concern towards the Kashmiri people. And being a journalist, you call this place beautiful paradise on earth. And in my journalistic terms, I call this place the most militarized zone in the world. So there has been a lot of change. So I would like to figure out the APDP, Association of Parents Disabled Persons. It has the record how many people have been disappeared and how many women being gang raped. But I have categorically going through some documents which I would like to bring forth in front of you. I believe after going through the documents from these non-governmental human rights organization from Kashmir. It has, it has summed it up, it has categorized the record, it has compiled the record in which they are saying that 8,000 people are still missing and there is no word for them. And international community has completely and categorically failed to deliver justice to these people. So going through away from the what actually my presentation is all about, I would like to tell you the aftermath of August 370, what the government of India has done. When the government of India has stripped the special status of 370, and there are actually in Kashmir, as so far as I reported, there are 11,319 government schools and 198 private schools. These schools were continuously shut, and the basic education of these children were completely, snatched. There is no rights in my Kashmir as a journalist that I have observed. Due to the longest curfew, due to students missed their opportunity when it comes to the outside university. As students are trying to get admission in outside world, they have missed that opportunity. And due to continuous clamp down, the minds of students are quite completely distrust. So undoubtedly, the government of India is launching a kind of attack on the quality education of the people, because we see that right now there is a kind of online education in my valley, and the director of school education has directed the school education to promote the students on online basis. And what kind of education it is, you can just, and it is believed that children are the future of nation. When you deprive the education from getting, when you deprive the children from getting basic education, it means it is nothing but the complete attack on the youths. So this was the first experience that I saw in my Kashmir. So gradually, the complete lockdown on Kashmir, it has also affected the tourism sector in my valley of Kashmir. And the KCC believe that, which is Commerce Chambers of Industry, it believed that the Kashmir has lost US dollar $2.4 billion has lost so far. And analysts believe that it could have been doubled, as the government of India has imposed COVID restrictions in Kashmir Valley. So I can say that the cost has now doubled. Coming back to the COVID-19, as we can see, the world is fighting with the COVID-19 the world is fighting for the COVID-19. In fact, the world want to get breakthrough to control the spread of coronavirus. But when it comes to Kashmir, the government of India is using coronavirus, COVID-19 as a cover to suppress more Kashmiri people. And what I saw in my Kashmir, there have been many new land laws are being imposed upon the Kashmiri people. And in fact, the government of India has come up with the issuance of domicile certificates. Means, after the abrogation of 35A, after the abrogation of Article 370, the government has issued domicile. As per the Indian Express report, the government has issued 319 lakh domicile certificates, and out of which 15,000 has been issued to the non-state subjects. This is a complete and colonial rule and colonial approach, the government of India to change the demography of Muslim majority into the minority. So what can I believe that apart from this, there is a now in between. Now the government of India has used NIA raids, and NIA, which is the National Investigation Agency. NIA started its raids not only in politicians, not only human rights activists. Now it has raided recently APDP office, which is only the source in Kashmir Valley that can tell us how many people have been disappeared. It is in fact the non-governmental human rights organization which can tell you how many people have disappeared, how many tortured, how many raped. So keeping in all of these things, so I believe that the oppressive tactics are being used against the Kashmiris, and there is no word for the international organization, there is no word for human rights organization. Then apart from this, they can issue only the statement when there is a firefighting situation on the ground, and we have seen that in past as well. Now imposition of the government of India has imposed now new land laws amid coronavirus. How the Indian government is taking advantage of COVID-19, they have imposed new land laws. Taking advantage of COVID-19, the government has imposed, quite apart from restrictions. Now they are, asking the forest dwellers that you are not part of this land, so you had to evacuate this place as early as possible. In fact, we saw what happened in Badgam area, Central Kashmir district, where the forest department has issued notes to these people that evacuate these land. In fact, the countless apple trees of the owners were chopped down without any consent. And now I would like to tell you, let me tell you categorically, whensoever the encounters were breaking out between security forces and the militants, the bodies were being given to the parents, the bodies were being given to their families, and they were commemorating, they were performing their last rites. But since the COVID-19 broke out in the entire world, and since the coronavirus hits the valley, the bodies of the militants are not being given to the people. So this is the desecration of the body, and in fact, it is the blatant breach of our religious rights. So there is no, even if a journalist can write, so we are not allowed to write. If even the common people cannot protest against these things. And recently the militant's body, the encounter broke out in Shopian, and his body was buried in 125 kilometers away from his home, and her mother has to travel every day to here and there. This can tell you what the situation is going in our Kashmir Valley. So impact of blockade in our religious freedom. So Jamia Masjid, which is a historic masjid in Kashmir Valley, it has been shut 138 days. Apart from this, the massive crackdown has been launched in the religious clerks. In fact, the religious organization has been banned. A top religious organization in our Kashmir Valley that's called as Jamaat Islamia, and it has been completely suppressed because it was only the organization which was openly and categorically supporting the voluntary groups, the poor ones. And believe me that it was for the first time in 1600 years, analysts believe that the Eid prayers were not allowed. Even it's happening in coronavirus. So religious processions, how the religious processions have been banned. When the whole Kashmir was under restrictions, there was only one way that the people took out the religious processions. This particularly Shia community hit the roads. When they know that there is political injustice is taking place in the system, and they used the Muharram procession as a tool to highlight their miseries, to highlight their oppression that is being taking place in the system. So what we saw. The brutal force has been used by the state-sponsored agencies to maim these people, to injure these people. So apart from this, we have seen. Let me wait. Now let me tell you important things. Now the press freedom in Kashmir. Since the government of India revoked the special status of Kashmir 370 and 35A, the press freedom in Kashmir has been completely suppressed. Journalism in Kashmir has always been challenging since decades, and reporting truth. What journalists are trying to do, they were always reporting truth, highlighting sexual crimes, and highlighting sexual crimes, highlighting oppressive tactics on the part of government. And for this, in the entire conflict, so far the 19 journalists have lost their lives. There is, in Kashmir, the press freedom has completely muzzled. Right now, the government of India want to control the thought of Kashmir. That is, thought control is being used. And there's a battle between two narratives. One, the state narrative, and another is local media narrative. State media narrative is only, their way is only that everything is novel in Kashmir. And the government of India wants to send a clear message that there is nothing is happening in Kashmir, nothing has happened in Kashmir, that there is, they maintain the fourth line of narrative that everything is normal in Kashmir. So it was, although that the IFJ International Federation has condemned this brutal assault, but that is not sufficient. There might be the international, Delhi should be pressurized by the international community for violating such rights. And after August 317, and when the Delhi distributed the special status, we saw Kamran Manzoor, Kamran Manzoor as senior photojournalist who has been tagged, who has been accused of stone pelter. Even the journalist has work too. They can tell you the stories from the ground. We have Asif Sultan, who is still who has spent 2 years in the jail. There is no word for them. And we have seen the Masrat Zahra's case, who have been booked under UAPA Act. So this can tell you that it is an attack on journalists, what common people can see. And we have seen the Gawhar Gilani, a prominent and top-notch journalist, in fact, the author of Kashmir Rage and Reason. He was also booked under UAPA. Qazi Shibli, the editor-in-chief of Kashmir and myself, who was about to, when he knew that the government of India wants to abrogate Article 370, when he knew that he knew the ill intentions of the central government, the government is going to abrogate Article 370, he tweeted, the government of India has decided to revoke the special status of Jammu and Kashmir. And what we saw after tweeting, Qadi Shibli became the first journalist after the revocation of Article 370. He was booked under PSA and has spent 9 months in the jail. So keeping in all of these things, the government of India is suppressing the voice from the Kashmir. Not only this, in India right now, in Indian administered Kashmir, there's a media gag, there's a communication gag, there's press gag. India has literally declared war on the people of Kashmir, and it needs the world attention. Even in being a journalist, I should not have said like these kind of emotions in front of you, but it is the reality from the ground. It should be accepted at any cost, because I have only one thing, that there is suppression, there is oppression, and it should be stopped as early as possible.
Thank you, Irshad. Irshad's emotional presentation on Kashmir being in the conflict zone, having all this suppression. We can understand your emotions, and we know that not only after August 5th, but before that, how the human rights violations were happening in Kashmir. And after August 5th, we saw the right to education being snatched, the right to medical care, the right to freedom of expression and freedom of religion, and the new land laws, and to change the demography of Kashmir. Many tactics are being used by the government of India to suppress the people's struggle. Now I will give floor to Daniela Khan, because she was the one who joined me first, so I should give her floor. Daniela is a specialist in linear alert Kohan and promoting global change makes through study of international affairs and human rights and gender equality. She is a Kashmiri, I must say. She is also a Kashmiri in a way. So Daniela, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Chairman Wani, and to KIIR and Dr. Gupta for this opportunity to speak today, along with these distinguished panelists. I'm very grateful for the opportunity. Before I give my remarks, I want to be clear that I do not speak for Kashmiris. I am not a Kashmiri. These are my own, and while based on numerous conversations with Kashmiris and experiences in Kashmir, I cannot speak for them. I'm incredibly privileged to have this platform to speak about the ongoing human rights abuses in Kashmir, and inshallah, I will do it justice. So I'm here today not as a regional expert, but as a deeply concerned and disturbed American citizen who has witnessed the ongoing human rights abuses in Kashmir firsthand since I started visiting the region back in 2016, shortly before the unrest following freedom fighter Burhan Wani's assassination, to present day abuses following the unconstitutional removal of Article 370 on August 5th by the BJP government back in 2019. As we all know, the world has been largely silent on the Kashmir issue for many years. And while there has been increased interest on the international stage, including a US congressional hearing back in 2019, it is nowhere near enough. Now there is a clear ethnic cleansing of Kashmiris occurring, a process that has been carefully planned and executed by Modi's BJP government, which is backed by the fascist RSS regime. It is beyond unacceptable that the world has continued to sit idly by and let it occur. So I want to bring a personal narrative to this conversation, because I think often we get so caught up in the politics of the conflict and the differing opinions that we lose sight of the real lives of Kashmiris that are affected day in and day out by this conflict. As previously mentioned, I started visiting Indian occupied Kashmir in 2016. At the time, I was a graduate student studying international politics and human rights in Scotland, and I met a Kashmiri girl in my program who invited me to visit her in Kashmir, and I wanted to learn about the conflict. And witnessing the situation on the ground was a profound experience. What triggered my desire to then work on Kashmir and become an activist for the Kashmiri people was one particular experience where I was in a car with my now husband, and I was dressed in traditional Kashmiri clothing, so it was not clear that I was a foreigner. And there was an army truck in front of us, and there were two soldiers on the back, and they pointed their guns at us. as we were driving and doing nothing wrong, just simply driving from point A to point B. And I exclaimed to my now husband that I was terrified, that I couldn't believe that this was happening. And for him, he said, "Oh, that's nothing." And I was shocked. As a Westerner, I was completely appalled that that was his reaction to this clear intimidation tactic, this fear that I hadn't experienced before, that he was so used to. And I suppose he was used to it because for his whole life, he had been living in conflict. He experienced an IED explosion next to his school as a teenager, and he has experienced seeing the remnants of bodies as a result of this conflict. So I think we all need to put ourselves in the shoes of Kashmiris for a minute, who have endured this level of fear, trauma, and loss for years. The psychological impact is unimaginable, and the ability to live freely tattered. Following the removal of Article 370, Modi's BJP government imposed a severe lockdown and communication blackout. No Wi-Fi, no data, no phone lines. It is no secret that this occurred to an extreme level. No matter how much some will try to deny the amount of human rights abuses that transpired, the 2019 US congressional hearing revealed the truth. And I just want to share what I experienced following this removal, now being married to a Kashmiri. We were unable to reach our loved ones in Kashmir for weeks. My aunt-in-law is also a politician in Kashmir, and she was placed under house arrest despite no crimes for over a year. I think we all know what it's like to be confined to your home due to COVID and the psychological impact that can cause. Over the course of several weeks following the communications blackout, I actually worked directly with Kashmiris to try to connect them with their loved ones overseas, given my contacts. This was an excruciating process because I had to connect with Kashmiris overseas first, who then connected with Kashmiris based in India, who then had to physically travel to the region, travel to the villages where Kashmiris were. Then those individuals would have to travel hours to a police station just to have access to a satellite phone to call their loved ones to let them know that they were okay for maybe just a minute or two. During this time, I also received countless testimonies from Kashmiris that the Indian Army in Kashmir was refusing to allow Kashmiris the ability to travel to the hospital for medical care or to receive medication. One woman in particular stated that her father was having heart attack-like symptoms, and when they tried to bring him to the hospital, they were turned away. Another shared that they were unable to refill critical medical prescriptions, which resulted in Kashmiris based in Delhi bringing medical supplies and traveling to Kashmir to disseminate them to people in need. Relatives were not even aware that loved ones had passed away overseas as they were unable to connect with one another. And the youth in particular have been severely impacted by this issue because they have been unable to receive a proper education due to the restrictions imposed and lack of internet. I've heard from numerous students that are suffering from severe mental issues, depression, anxiety, because they have been unable to complete their degrees due to these disruptions. The Indian government continues to impose inhumane restrictions and immense brutality on Kashmiris. They have suffocated the region with hundreds of thousands of troops, making it the most militarized zone in the world, like Mr. Hussain mentioned. And I want to clearly outline some of the human rights abuses that have occurred for decades and worsened, because I think it's really important for the international community to understand, and for those that are not familiar with the conflict that are listening here today. So here in the US, Trump talks about fake news. Well, the Indian government loves fake encounters where Kashmiris are falsely claimed to be militants and killed, which have recently increased. We know this has been going on for years. Disappearances of Kashmiris, leaving many women as half widows and mothers childless. Pelleting of peaceful Kashmiri protesters, leaving many permanently blinded and injured. Mass rapes of women and girls. Torture of imprisoned Kashmiris, stories of which I shudder to even think of repeating due to the brutality. No freedom of press, as Dr. or Mr. Hussain has mentioned. Curfews, lockdowns, I have experienced them myself endlessly in Kashmir. Crippling the economy, leading to widespread poverty. Communications restrictions, as mentioned above, and surveillance. No foreign media and activists following August 5th, despite attempts to visit the region and examine the situation on the ground. We know that there were, I believe there was a US congressman that tried to go and was turned away. Attempts to silence US members of Congress who have spoken about the human rights abuses, most notably Indian American Congresswoman Pramila Jayapal. Countless activists that have had their social media pages about the conflict removed, and I suppose it's only a matter of time before mine is as well. A new bill that has passed that now allows Indians to buy land in Kashmir, which is furthering the ethnic cleansing of Kashmiris by forcing them out of their own homes. Fear psychosis techniques. I think one example is the braid choppers. If anybody remembers that occurred, where Indian agents were going around cutting off women's hair, instilling this mass hysteria where women were confined to their homes and fearful to leave. I think this is an example of the distractions that the Indians try to instill on Kashmiris to prevent them from mobilizing about the cause. And then, of course, other disinformation tactics. We saw a recent report that came out about all the tactics India has been using to cause distrust about Pakistan and further distract Kashmiris. So again, I wanted to list these all very clearly because I think it's imperative for the international community to understand the severity of the situation. So what's next? As we all know, Kashmiris have been traumatized for years and are eager for a normal way of life. They are fearful for their lives. It has certainly been more difficult to mobilize in protest due to the increased military presence, including the COVID-19 pandemic, which has further strained the region. But protests are essential in sending a message to the international community that all is not well in Kashmir. Kashmiris already struggle to have a voice, and to remain voiceless in their own home has unfortunate repercussions for the cause. Moreover, Kashmiris that I have spoken to think that the turnout in the recent elections, instead of boycotting them, are because some voters are swayed by the candidates that say that they will work toward restoring Article 370 and 35A and will provide economic solutions to their dire living circumstances, but they did not vote because they accept India's occupation. But as a result of that, the BJP government has been able to portray that all is well in Kashmir and that democracy has prevailed. And therefore, the international community is less likely to intervene in these ongoing human rights abuses. Unfortunately, we are losing momentum as a result, and that needs to be restored in order to hold Modi's regime accountable and firmly address the human rights abuses. I will say that Kashmiris have to take hold of what they want for their future and put it in their hands, and it is really now or never. I have always supported Kashmiris' right to self-determination, and it is ultimately up to them to decide their fate. But what is evident is the gross human rights violations that India has done in Kashmir for decades, and the international community will likely not engage if Kashmiris are to speak on the ground, because it unfortunately implies compliance. I also think that there is a unique and paramount opportunity under the forthcoming Biden administration to address the Kashmir conflict, particularly by working with Pakistan. Pakistan has been increasing their diplomatic efforts broadly on Kashmir and should certainly continue. We cannot forget Prime Minister Imran Khan's profound speech at the United Nations in 2019 that helped elevate the Kashmir issue globally, among other ongoing efforts. I have personally attended several events at the Pakistan Embassy here in Washington, DC, aimed at raising awareness about the issue, and I am very grateful for their work and genuine concerns for the Kashmiri people. I encourage Pakistan to keep up its efforts, to work closely with the Biden administration, and to most importantly, continue to listen to Kashmiri voices directly and in order to best work together and establish transparency. I believe that this is key to a path forward. India is not willing to sit at the table. They have shown us that again and again, and we must pursue other avenues at this time to save Kashmiri lives. So to conclude, as I know I've probably spoken way too much, I'd like to share a quote that I think is an important reminder for us all. Kashmir is a place of love and resistance, end quote. We cannot give up the fight. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniela, for ending with a nice note that Kashmir is a place of love and resistance and we cannot give up. So your wonderful presentation, you covered all the aspects, your own experience, your own testimony, and also the testimonies of the different victims you have been in touch with. So thank you very much. Now I will like to give floor to a brave daughter of Kashmir, a daughter of a brave man of Kashmir, Ms. Sahar Shah. She's daughter of Shabir Shah, who was called prisoner of conscience, Nelson Mandela of Kashmir. He has been incarcerated and he's still languished in Delhi's Tihar jail. So, Sir, your time starts now, but be quick.
Yeah, sure. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. First of all, I thought that it was mainly about only the human rights thing, but now if I have been given this platform, so let me start by this. That today, like all of you know, 10th December is celebrated as Human Rights Day across the globe, that proclaims inalienable rights which everyone is entitled to as a human being, be it religion, sex, race, political or national status. As I belong to the bleeding and burning paradise, Kashmir, human rights abuses are an ongoing issues. Like mass killings, enforced disappearance, rapes, ranging from very bad sexual abuses to political repression and suppression of freedom of speech. Human rights violation could be summarized as a loss of lives, lack of the right to live, access to courts, illegal and arbitrary decisions on the custody of civilians, the teenagers. In Kashmir, the use of pellet guns, the use of shotguns, use of pellet gun, use of shotguns, and torture, the illegal abduction of people, lack of access to education. Schools are, most of the time, schools are closed. Restrictions from freedom of expression in traditional and social media. If a person posts something on social media, the next day his house has been raided, and there's a lot of problem they face. So honestly, today I would like to say that UN has remained a mere spectator in face of India's human rights violation in Kashmir. See, human kindness has never weakened the people's stamina, the country's or a nation's stamina. A nation, be it India or any other nation, does not have to be cruel to be tough. I would like to quote a famous poet, I don't know its exact name, something said. He says that इंसान तो हर घर में पैदा होता है, इंसान तो हर घर में पैदा होता है, लेकिन इंसानियत कहीं कहीं जन्म लेती है. Which means humans are born in every house, but humanity takes birth in only in few places. So today I, Seher Shabir Shah, stand here, one girl among many, speaking not for myself, but for my people, for Kashmir, my father, and for those whose voice can't be heard, those who have not given their right to live peacefully, the right of equality and opportunity, their right to be educated. I would like to conclude what I said by saying the sayings of my father, Shabir Shah, whose voice thunders across the time and space, the prisoner of conscience, the Nelson Mandela of Kashmir, who has spent 33 years in imprisonment and is still in Tihar jail, New Delhi. He said that we have been vilified, denounced, condemned, murdered, beaten, jailed, tortured and censored, but never defeated. They have forcibly occupied our land, but they cannot enslave our hearts. Thank you so much, everyone. And also, if you give me a bit time, I can just tell you a small example of human rights violation that my father is facing. Right now, he's in a 4x4 cell in Tihar jail, having a commode in the same room, no light, no good proper food to eat. Isn't this human rights violation? Is it his crime that he's asking for freedom of Kashmir? He's asking for the birthright that everyone deserves. just because of that, they are not even treating him as a political prisoner. And I, on behalf of not only myself or anyone else, I just want to speak on behalf of every Kashmiri youth who, be it on even little teenagers who just tried to speak about Kashmir and their accounts were banned, they were threatened. Even my account was put down just by one post that I had written about my father, because the way when I go to meet my father in Tihar jail, they just pull my hijab out, they just frisk my whole body, they check my hair, they check my mouth, and the way the abuses we have to hear there, it's really intolerable. And it is simply what a very brilliant example of and clear example of human rights violation. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Sahar. Wonderful presentation. You spoke from your heart what is going on in Kashmir and what your father and other prisoners are facing in different jails of India, and what the younger generation of Kashmir is facing right now in Kashmir. Now I'll give floor to Todsi, a good friend of Kashmir, a social activist, a musician, a songwriter. So Todd, floor is yours.
Thank you. First of all, our journalist, Irshad, and Sahar, your father, I'm praying for them and their families, courageous people, and all of those activists and people fighting for just the basic, simple rights to live in Kashmir. My heart goes out to them every day. I have mostly Kashmiri employees here in Islamabad at Comprehensive Disaster Response Services. We've been working for 15 years since the Zalzala in 2005, when I lived for 5 years solid right near the line of control, and learned about the stories of Kashmiris, and also learned that I didn't learn anything about this from the US media. In all of the years before, none of the information or stories or things that happened or the whole background of the conflict was never told to the American people, and still hasn't. They don't have an understanding of it. The only thing I heard before I came to serve for the earthquake was that Kashmir separatists wanted to separate from India, and they wanted to do so violently, and they were terrorists. And this is what the narrative has been. So the American peoples and the Western countries, the people of those nations, their minds have been brainwashed largely. So unless they come to know from some personal experience, or from somebody like me or Daniela telling them, you know, on some whatever platform or whatever way that we can impart that information to them, unless that happens, most people just really are ignorant of this. So I think that what is really important going forward, because quite honestly, I think we have seen that the Arab countries, other Muslim countries, the West, America, none of these powerful leaders of these countries or their media that are basically bought and paid for by the corporate structure that is tied in with selling bullets and bombs and making money off of war. That seems to be the business model. None of them are interested in the human rights of people in Kashmir and Palestine and these places. Rather, they are interested in India's money and markets and the larger economic picture that benefits them personally. Foundational documents that say who we are as Americans and what we believe in. Unfortunately, those documents have all been forgotten about when it comes to the greed of our politicians nowadays and the corporate interests that have forgotten about our founding principles, that go for the money and the power. And so they know very well what India and the BJP and the RSS stand for. They know that they're modern day fascists. They know that they have destroyed their own constitution in order to do what they've done in Kashmir, and they know how they treat people of lower castes or minorities as second class, third class, fourth class citizens. They know their brutality, but they simply just don't care because the money is good and India is a big market, and seems to be that that's what they are interested in. And I think we've kind of seen that this plays out over and over and over, that there are very few senators and congressmen and leaders that care about this issue and do something and even pay lip service to it. I don't have a lot of faith that the Biden administration is going to be any different, because candidate Obama, he spoke about Kashmir a little bit as a candidate, but then in 8 years of his presidency, we didn't hear Kashmir mentioned once that I can remember of note. So I have no faith in the US government. I have no faith in the Western media. I think they've all sold out, and I think that they're all hypocrites, and I think that they are largely psychopathic and narcissistic and really don't care and don't give a damn about humanity or suffering people in Kashmir. So I think no matter what we do, we can beg them, we can bomb them, we can, whatever we do, it's just not going to matter to them. They're not going to do what they should do, which is to economically boycott India and make it so painful for them to do what they're doing that they would let go of some of these draconian measures. But nobody's going to do it, and so India is not going to stop. So really, there's only, really for me, there's only two outcomes here. One is that the almighty creator would throw a comet at this planet and be done with all of us because we've failed as human beings, and maybe unleash a worse virus than COVID-19 so that it can wipe all of us out, so that if we're not going to give justice to anybody, that we can have justice for nobody. So I hope that doesn't happen. I hope the other thing happens, and that's that the younger generation, the kids, the young people, the youth of this world would somehow be reached by people like our brave, courageous journalist, Irshad Hussain, and all of you wonderful activists. I would hope that somehow we can communicate with the youth of this world, that they can somehow understand what it means to be human being, and they can understand how important it is to respect the human rights and the dignity and humanity of all people, and that injustice anywhere is injustice everywhere, and that we can somehow maybe move on from the greed and the narcissistic, psychopathic nature of the system of the world that we've created now, and somehow we can rely on our youth of the world and show them what's going on, and hopefully that we can appeal to their sense of humanity and their hearts, so that the collective humanity could somehow end the unjust system that we have in Kashmir, Palestine, and many other places, and even in America, where our African Americans and our Native Americans and minorities are mistreated, and Muslims are made to feel unwelcome and banned from coming, and all of these things that happen. I hope, and I look to only one hope for this world, and that's that somehow the young people can respond to the injustices and right the wrongs in the past and that are going on right now. Otherwise, I hope that we annihilate each other in a nuclear war, or that God throws a comet at us and just takes the whole thing out. And I'm sorry that I feel that way, but I would rather have that happen than to continue living in a world of injustice. And I say that as a person who has a Pakistani wife with a 4-month-old baby in her belly. And I would like that baby to be born in a world of justice. But I don't know if that's going to happen. But I really, really honestly hope and pray for this world that we come out of this and that we don't go the other direction. And that's all I have to say. I pray for all of you amazing, brave, courageous people, that you'll have some success reaching out to the young people of this world and asking anybody that cares about this to please call, write, email, message as many people who don't know about this situation as you can, and try to turn the tide one person at a time, so that maybe in some kind of miraculous grassroots level that we can change this horrific, unjust situation that we have in this world. Thank you.
Thank you, Todd. You spoke from common Kashmiri's emotions, what a common Kashmiri sees in Kashmir, how he realizes the situation and what he thinks. The same way every Kashmiri thinks, they say, come and bulldoze us or give us freedom. That is the only thing. And these younger people like Irshad, Sair, and others will continue their struggle to galvanize support of the younger generation of the world, so that we could see the peace, and the people of Kashmir can also reap the fruits of that peace too. So with this, I'll now invite Mariana Zocca. She's the human rights activist from Italy and also an expert on international human rights law. A good friend of Kashmir, has been with us for many occasions in Geneva and other places. She's always there when we call her. Mariana, floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad today to share this panel with you. And I'm really happy to have been invited to speak up for Kashmir. It's really difficult for me to speak now after those great speeches that my colleagues have just shared. But I will try to talk about the day that we are living today and the Declaration of Human Rights. Today is the International Day of Human Rights due to the fact that in 1948, the United Nations published the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, that together with the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, constitute the Bill of Rights. It means that those three international covenants are at the basis of human rights. The Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights states out that we are all free and equal. We are all born free and equal in dignity and rights. It means that whatever is our nationality, wherever we may have been born, whatever is the place where we are living, our states, our government, our politicians have the duty to fulfill and guarantee us all the rights that are embodied in the International Declaration of Human Rights and in all the treaty bodies, the 9 treaty bodies that UN have further published after this declaration. In 1948, the General Assembly of United Nations decided to publish and to state this Bill of Rights and to publish the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, setting out a common standard with the aim to strive for progressive measures at the national and international levels in order to secure the universal and effective recognition and observance of human rights. As I have just said now, all the member states of United Nations are bound and have the duty to fulfill those rights. States have constitutions and domestic measures directly inspired by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And I am so sad today to say that in many places of the world, as you have already said, all those rights are not fulfilled and there are people that are suffering for those violations. You have just given us lots of witnesses of ways through which people are suffering. Not respecting human rights and not guaranteeing the respect of human rights is turning into those violations that you have clearly and widely expressed and told us today. It turns into a huge suffering for each human being. So I used to say that I am a human rights activist, and I have been so lucky to have been born in a democratic state. I'm from Italy, and I do have all the human rights possible, and I believe in a democratic and peaceful state. So I have the duty to speak up and to keep on fighting for all the people that are now suffering for those violations worldwide. We cannot accept that in places such as Kashmir, such as Palestine, something like curfews, siege are going on. This is not acceptable, but I will go deeply in my speech. Kashmir has a long story of division and occupation. As you have already said, Kashmir has the duty to see its independence. That is not possible to see now due to the siege of Indian government. Mostly Indian governments and Indian constitution at the article 370 and 35.8 guaranteed to the Kashmiri population a certain degree of autonomy that today is not possible for the Kashmiri people to see fulfilled. Moreover, since August 2019, Indian government is putting Kashmir under the longest curfew for democratic states. India is supposed to be a democratic state and is taking at stake the Kashmiri population it is illegally occupying. Moreover, there are a lot of human rights that are being violated and a lot of crimes that are being committed against the Kashmiri population. The idea behind Indian policies is that Kashmiri population living in the area of Jammu and Kashmir is that it is the geographical Muslim area, whilst the Indian government is having another idea for this area. It is changing its demographic and geographic composition. So not to have anymore a Muslim majority area, but to have a mixed one. Whilst the already cited articles of the Indian Constitution guaranteed the majority and the autonomy granted for the Muslim people, living in Jammu and Kashmir. So there are lots of articles embodied in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights issued in 1948 that India is violating. We can say that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is not binding for the member states. However, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and International Covenant on Social and Economic and Cultural Rights are legally binding for states. It means that states have to fulfill, to respect, and to grant that rights embodied there to their citizens. India is part of both of those declarations. And India is largely violating civil and political rights of Kashmiri people. India is unlawfully limiting the freedom of movement of Kashmiri people. India is illegally limiting the rights of information of Kashmiri people. I think about people that you have already cited, like young people. Young people in Kashmir are forbidden to go to school. Young people in Kashmir are forbidden to play with each other in the streets. I do think about all the people that are forbidden to go to work due to the restriction on right of movement. I can give you an example. Here in Italy, we have been forbidden to move from home due to the COVID restriction. This is a lawful restriction of civil and whatever kind of rights, because it is due to a health emergency. India doesn't have any kind of justification for this restriction mostly because those restrictions are happening in Kashmiri territory since August 2019. There are lots of other rights that India is violating. For example, India has restricted the right to use internet and other kind of communication. So I am asking myself and you, how is it possible for Kashmiri people to get the right information to deal with COVID-19 pandemic? How is it possible for Kashmiri people to go to the hospital, for example, as you have already said, to get the right healthy rights, to get, for example, to see their parents, to go to the hospital? How is that possible for Kashmiri people if we put the whole population under a siege? Moreover, the international humanitarian law foresees that the occupying part grants a certain degree of rights to the population, such as the right of health, as I have already said. For Kashmiri people, it's not possible to reach the hospital, as we have already explained before. So India is illegally violating the whole body of international human rights. And I am so sad to say this on December 2020, after a long time since 1914. In 1914, the international community has issued the Universal Declaration of Human Rights after what has happened during the Second World War, with the aim for the world humanity to stop and not to see again the world violations that have happened during the period of the Second World War. Instead, today we are seeing a huge violation. As many of you have already cited, why we are talking today about Kashmir. In my opinion, it is important to talk about Kashmir because we have already seen and we have all the elements to say what is gonna be in Kashmiri territories. In my opinion, what is happening in Kashmir has already happened in Palestinian territory. It is a very close situation. Mostly because, for example, Israel has attacked the Palestinian territories and the Palestinian people properly for their belonging to the racial and social and their ethnical belong to this population. The same thing is doing India in the respect of Kashmir. What I mean is that India is attacking Kashmir because the Kashmiri people are Muslim, and because in the Kashmiri in Jammu and Kashmir territories, the majority of people are Muslim. The international criminal law is defining this crime not just as war crimes or crimes against humanity. It is a genocide. Attempting to destroy a certain population, to modify the demographical population of a certain area and trying to change it, it is a genocide. And we have already seen this in the history, throughout the history. We have already seen too many times how it is going out. We have already seen how it can be stopped. But first of all, as you have already said, by the moment that I am sharing this panel with great speakers, the first thing is to speak up, talk about this issue. For example, here in Italy, we don't have that much information about Kashmir. We don't have any people talking about this issue. And I'm really afraid about that. I am really afraid that the international community is not taking care properly about the issue of Kashmir and the issue of other populations living under an illegal siege. Then the last thing that I would like to underline is that in each population under siege there are minorities, and I would like to address my speech to women. We all know that during warfare and during siege, the degree of gender violations and attacks against women used to rise. We don't have, unfortunately, the right number of violations committed against the bodies of women, and this is due to a lot of motivations. And I would like to say that we should take into account that women are living a true nightmare. Many women in Kashmir have been left alone. Many women have been left widowed due to the disappearances of their male counterparts, and so they are facing high levels of gender violations. And I would also like to address my speech for all the people that are suffering for healthy disease, and they are not able to being properly taken into consideration by the health system. If you stop people from having the freedom of movement, of speech, and of information, then you are giving them a very bad standard of life. Instead, in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was meant to ensure each people in this world to guarantee high standard of human rights, high standard of living. And we all deserve all these standards of living by the moment that we are all human rights. And that's it. I don't have anything to add because you have already clearly described the unlawful situation of Kashmir. And as a human rights activist, the only thing that I can say in closure is that we cannot accept, and the whole international community cannot accept this situation, wherever it may be, wherever it may happen. And we all have the duty to work and to speak up in order to make all those violations stop. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Mariana, for your presentation. You spoke at length about international law and the sufferings of people of Kashmir. You spoke that people in Italy do not know about Kashmir, that you are the ambassador of people of Kashmir. As a young human rights activist and a legal expert, it's your duty to make your efforts to realize the people in Italy and the civil society in Italy, the academia in Italy and others, so that they could come to know about the situation in Kashmir. My next speaker will be from Kashmir. We will come back to Kashmir. Naeema Ahmed Mahjood doesn't need any introduction. Presenter, broadcaster, writer, and she has been also the chairperson of the Women Commission in Kashmir. She wrote extensively on Kashmir before this episode of 5th August, and also after the 5th of August. She wrote extensively on different topics of Kashmir, and her documentary on BBC is a very memorable one for the people of Kashmir, where she exposed all the human rights violation and the situation in Kashmir. Naeema Ahmed Mahjood, floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Good to see you all. I really appreciate your efforts and concern about the prevailing situation in Kashmir. My sincere thanks to Kia for inviting me to share my anguish over the harsh realities of Jammu and Kashmir that has become one of the most volatile places in the world. I will be sharing my thoughts mostly about, as Marina was saying, about Kashmiri woman who is at the front bearing all the brunt of this deadliest situation. Jammu and Kashmir is suffering in silence at the moment, facing death and destruction every day, losing hope of living a normal day, normal life. Human Rights Day is celebrated every year, and we all attempt to become part of this great event. It gives us a chance to highlight the plight of subjugated and suppressed people across the globe with this purpose that they will be heard, they will get justice, and they won't get let down by international community. Think of the people whose political, economic, and social rights have been snatched, whose kids have not seen school for almost 18 months, whose women have to go through humiliations, and whose youth have to keep hiding even their phones. Every moment of the day, where will they look for help? From whom will they seek support? And who will become their savior? Do we, as human rights activists, supporters, or sympathizers, really become the voice of forcibly made mute population? Do we try in seeking intervention of policymakers in breaking the cycle of the violence? And do we engage different governments for resolution of the core issue that could give a chance of new lease of life to the forgotten, tormented, and deprived population of Kashmir? These few compelling questions are hovering over every Kashmiri's mind who are suffering from the degradation of their basic dignity since the partition of the subcontinent in 47. The life and livelihood of 12 million people has become a cheap sport for unprecedented number of security forces in the valley who enjoy impunity under the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. I can tell you every single soul in Kashmir has a horrible story to tell. Since 5th August 2019, when in a broad daylight, 12 million people were robbed of their constitution, identity, status that was enshrined in the Indian constitution itself. And when state of Jammu and Kashmir was downgraded to 2 union territories, more than 100 central laws have been implemented, disempowering local indigenous population, which has culminated into evictions and demolitions of their dwellings recently. The argument given by the BJP government was to integrate Kashmir with India for development and normalcy that would ensure peaceful life and enhance means of livelihood. But Kashmir since then has turned into a biggest concentration camp, losing the semblance of any normality now. Scrapping Article 370 could not succeed in ending the long struggle for political rights as it was meant to be. Indeed, instead, it has been attracting many young and teenage boys to join in. Every day, young lives are consumed by the violence, and human dignity is reduced by intensified humiliating acts and ordinances. According to recent figures, and Irshad might bear me out, more than 200 people have been killed since 5th August in encounters, searches, and these cordon operations, whatever they call it, and funeral gatherings. People cannot talk, reporters cannot write, netizens cannot post on social platforms, or women cannot complain because of harsh and discriminatory restrictive laws recently implemented, which can put them into jail without any trial for many months. Traders, lawyers, journalists, civil activists, politicians, young, kids, and women are forced to write bonds for keeping silence and accepting disempowerment of their basic rights. The digital lockdown for more than a year has caused loss of more than $3 billion to Kashmir trade, and thousands of workers have become jobless. And their losses have now doubled due to this pandemic. International community that has become aware of the Hindutva agenda seems mostly tight-lipped on the plight of Jammu and Kashmir, and 12 million people of Jammu and Kashmir have a question for this community. Cannot your muteness amount to criminal silence? To give you the sense of helplessness Kashmiri women are feeling, I would take a chance to read a page of my book that is a continuation of my first novel, Lost in Terror, which has a focus mainly on the women of conflict zone. This is not the story of Mrs. Parveen Ahangar, who sits in protest at Pratap Parak for one day every month, waiting to know about her missing son, who was arrested 30 years before. But this is a story of more than 10,000 women whose husbands have never returned home after they disappeared in custody since the eruption of armed movement in Jammu and Kashmir. They have got now nothing left except hope. I won't be relating the story of Kunan Poshpora's young girl Bhakti, who has not overcome the nightmares of the fateful night of early 90s when she failed an attempt to jump out of a window after witnessing her mother and 40 other women groped and gang raped by hundreds of soldiers who had come to cordon off the twin villages of Kupwara. But I will relate you the story of Shbayan's Nilofer and Asya, who were abducted and raped in the dark of the night. Their bodies had become rotten in the heap of the rain-soaked crops they had gone to harvest for the winter. Their blood-stained and torn trousers are still hanging in their balcony. The character of this story is not the 8-year-old nomad girl of Rasana, who was abducted, drugged, raped, and stoned to death by her Hindu neighbors, but those young girls living on the line of control are main characters of my story, who under the guise of frisking are getting molested every day while passing through bunkers to school. They cannot whiff about it due to the threat of getting their parents killed in mysterious conditions. My story may not tell you the hardships or stigma faced by the hundreds of women of Dardpora village, which we have named as Half Widows Village. But those 500 physically crippled widows of Shanglipura might transcend you to the meadows of Tos Maidan, whose husbands were killed during weeding and grazing their cattle when army soldiers had left live ammunition and remnants of unexploded shells after their military exercise in the area. Let me not delve into the marital status of 40 years old 40,000 women of Kashmir who did not get married because most of the boys they were engaged to got killed in the armed movement. Even they couldn't be traced after being buried at unknown places without names on their graves. Rather, I will delve into the story of millions of married women waiting outside their homes during search and cordon operations when their husbands are taken away to a field for identification parade to see if they will return back to them. Our women cannot afford to stay alone at home. They live under constant fear of barging soldiers. Do not compel me to make you to hear the screams of thousands of women whose fathers, brothers, sons, husbands, including Seher's father, have been languishing in Indian jails for decades and seem forgotten now. But I will not let you walk away from the sobs of those 13,000 mothers whose innocent children as young as 12 years were taken out of bed in the middle of the night of 4th August 2019 and were placed in unknown prisons thousands of miles away from Kashmir. Some mothers keep screaming during every night, even if their sons have returned recently. There are 4 million women in my book who you might find funny for being considered symbol of courage, strength, martyrdom, and bravery. But there are no expressions or words to describe their turning into stones and rocks and no way to find the timeline of how long it took them to get their tears dried up. They do not close their eyes. They only gaze at the dark shadows. This page cannot tell you the despair of the thousands of working women who have become accustomed to showing their ID cards every after 10 to 20 meters to security guards at every nook and cranny of the valley, and how they have learned the art of covering their faces in order to avoid the smirk of the soldiers. But my page may take a snippet of a 60-year fishmonger near the Amira Kadal Bridge, who now finds it amusing to watch dribbling soldiers from nearby bunker and makes fun of repeating the scene of pulling out guts of fish in front of them. In this story, there is no space left for security women of UP who would take pleasure in searching women's bodies in interrogation centers, then expose them to her male counterparts to ridicule and taunt these stripped and lifeless bodies. But there will be a proper place for Arundhati Roy, who has become the voice of them and gives them hope to stay alive. The theme of my book will not include the rising suicide cases of the army soldiers after they watch the mutilation of the dead bodies killed by their colleagues during the fake encounters, but it will involve the story of special forces that set fire to the hut and paddy stock of 80-year-old woman of South Kashmir and forced her to beg for shelter and food. My story has deliberately ignored the dream of a mother of Burhan Wani who wanted to give him higher education. Instead, he vowed to fight against the atrocities he witnessed during operations. But I cannot afford to ignore 10,000 young boys and girls who have been deprived of their eyesight by indiscriminate firing of pellets and bullets. Their eyes have become now dead sockets. I'm not courageous enough to speak about the 4-year-old Hiba who had undergone several eye surgeries after she got pellets in her eye, but I feel elated to mention Insha, a brave girl of Shupayan who passed her board examination despite losing her both eyes. 65% of the women in my story are declared to be psychologically ill as a result of the constant violence, daily funerals, and loss of livelihood. But there is a mention of few counselors and psychiatrists who have become schizophrenic by the magnitude of ailing mental health in the valley. Mention of those ordinary women is a least priority who have lost the courage to live, not to speak of increasing domestic violence or harassment in institutions. I will never mention any such commission or probe that has no powers to deal with hidden horror stories eating away Kashmiri women. This is the first page of my book that paints only few shades of women's life in Kashmir. As you know, Kashmir is considered the paradise on earth, or you might call it the Switzerland of Asia, but political turmoil, border clashes, betrayals, bloodshed, and now vendetta policy of Hindutva have made Kashmiri place as a beautiful hell on the earth, and because now the woman finds herself surrounded by gun and gunmen only. I want to ask you a question. Shall we wait to see her dying slow death, or we should keep crying our heart out to wake up this mute and silent world to listen to her sobs and save her from further degradation and dehumanization? Thank you very much for listening to me with patience.
Thank you, Naima ji. You took me from village to village, from street to street, from home to home, where I could see the miseries of people of Kashmir, the rights violations happening, and the torture and the turmoil people of Kashmir are going through. It was a wonderful presentation, a heart-reaching presentation on your behalf, as you have been always wonderful and articulate. My last speaker will be Karen Joda Fisher. again a friend of Kashmir. She has been in Kashmir for a longer period of time, has witnessed all the turmoil in Kashmir, and because of his activism, the Modi-led government asked her to leave Kashmir. Karen, you are there. Floor is yours. Hello, Karen. You hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Since I didn't know I was going to be on this, I'd like to use something I shared in another seminar just recently. I hope that's okay. So, good morning and assalamu alaikum. Thank you for inviting me to participate here. For once, I've actually prepared notes because it is still very hard for me to talk about many of the things I witnessed while living in Kashmir, and I would like to remain focused. The memories never fade enough for me to become more composed. Just last fall, when I met Representative Sheila Jackson-Lee after a congressional hearing on human rights violations in Kashmir, I broke down while telling her about the Machil fake encounter in 2008. I wrote this in an opinion piece for Local Daily. I saw many of the villagers near starvation because they could not break through the giant barricades erected around their entire district as part of a collective punishment for speaking out. All the way home from Baramulla to Srinagar, while seeing new and even higher barricades being erected and more people being rounded up on the side of the highway, I wondered not only how I could rescue them all, but what might happen to me if I wrote about what I saw and felt. Thanks again for giving me the opportunity to speak about it here. As a German, it is never easy to talk about the topic of genocide. We grew up seeing images of piles of bodies found in camps that had been liberated. Of course, that was many years later when the Holocaust was finally permitted to be taught in school. Then, as students, we tried to grasp the enormity of millions of people having been slaughtered for their racial and religious identity. Similarly, much later, I always wondered how the genocides in Cambodia and Rwanda could possibly happen after the entire world had said never again. Of course, nobody can ever really imagine the tragedy of millions dying and often in relatively small time frames. Usually too much deliberation goes into the management of crises to actually do anything to effectively prevent mass killings anywhere and also clearly define the meaning of genocide. That is why at first I had problems using the term genocide when it comes to the crimes against humanity committed in Kashmir. I had always thought it needed to be much more massive in scale and more concentrated in execution to qualify. But then over the years, and with killings never stopping, I realized that genocide is also a process that can happen in slow motion or spurts and often spread over decades or even longer. It can also involve demographic changes, not only through mass killings like during the Jammu massacre of 1947, but also through ethnic flooding as is happening now at an accelerated pace. I am now using that term for Kashmir without a moment of hesitation. But like with all genocides anywhere and much before our time, it is very difficult to fully grasp numbers of the dead and disappeared in their totality. In Kashmir also, while looking at the statistics in the many reports prepared by Kashmiri civil society groups, looking at Kashmir civil society groups may induce a sense of shock. It never quite hits you to the core. Why else could people and policymakers all over the world ignore such never-ending brutalities even today? I have resolved that tragedy is individual, and while statistics may be meaningful in history books, stories of individual victims have to be remembered and must be told again and again by us for anybody to really understand the cruelty of their slaughter. With that in mind, I would like to talk about some of the killings I personally witnessed while in Kashmir and also the circumstances under which they happened. Many of them were very highly publicized locally, but still nothing ever changed and nobody has ever been brought to book. Starting in early 2006 and into 2007, my first years in Kashmir, there were a series of fake encounters which perhaps for the first time were actually investigated. There was Abdul Rehman Padar, a carpenter from Gandabal, Shaukat Ahmed, a daily laborer from Badgam, Ali Mohammed Padar, a carpenter from Kokarnak, Nasir Ahmed Deka and Ghulam Nabi Wani, both bakers from Gandabal. All of them were exhumed for identification and subsequently declared innocent. Police had picked them up, branded them Pakistani terrorists, and killed them in fake encounters together with the army and the CRPF. All the officers received cash awards and promotions. None was ever put before a civilian court or put away for murder. But it was the beginning of Kashmiris becoming more vocal about crimes committed them and demanding justice. In 2008, the massive crackdown following the uprising caused by the Amarnath land row resulted in the death of at least 60 protesters and grave injuries to thousands who had been unarmed and protesting completely peacefully without a single stone in their hand. One of the most prominent protesters killed during the Muzaffarabad Chalo was Sheikh Aziz, a Hurriyat leader who was shot by security forces no more than 200 feet from me. I still remember our panic over how to save his life. Of course, the scene was too chaotic to get him any medical help. Most of the other protesters were young boys and villagers who were shot dead without ever having been a threat to anybody. Of course, the Indian media claimed that Pakistani militants had infiltrated into the crowd and were shooting protesters themselves to create more chaos and anti-India sentiment. During that time, I spent most days taking journalists around in my own car because I had a press curfew pass from a local daily and knew that security forces would not harm a foreigner openly nor beat up the journalists with me. Much of that time, we drove severely injured protesters, including women and children, to emergency wards of local hospitals. Among them, several sumo drivers whose cars had been attacked with petrol bombs by Hindutva fanatics on the Jammu-Srinagar highway and who had sustained life-threatening burns all over their bodies. Many never made it out of the hospitals. The brutality of the crackdown was, of course, the beginning of the Kashmir Intifada, which stretched all the way past 2016 and later following funerals of local rebels. It was also the political awakening of an entire new generation of Kashmiris, which is much angrier and more uncompromising than their elders ever were. In 2009, we woke up to news about the discovery of the bodies of Niloufar and Asya from Shopian in South Kashmir. Niloufar was 22 and Asya 17. Both had been raped, killed by security forces, and deposited at the banks of a nearly dry riverbank bed not far from the local SOG camp. All hell broke loose when the news about their rape and murder was broadcast. After the initial forensic investigation confirmed rape of both the girls, several policemen attached to the SOG camp were arrested. Shockingly, a team of crisis managers was flown in from Delhi, and soon the entire sordid story was rewritten by security agencies. The girls were exhumed, and a revised forensic examination by a doctor selected by IB claimed that neither of the girls was raped and that they had drowned on their way home from an orchard in the rapids of the river. When I took a journalist from Delhi to the exact spot where the bodies had been found, he admitted that the water level was so low that not even a small child could have drowned. But he insisted that it could not have been rape because the security forces attached to the SOG camp were Hindus, and Hindus certainly did not rape. He thought it might have been domestic violence instead. He, of course, was one who had never believed in the gang rapes of Konam and had written a piece how it was nothing but a plot by Pakistani propagandists to turn locals against the army and India. The protests that followed the murders of the two girls were mostly localized but severe enough in and around Trinidad that dozens of youth were gravely injured and several died. It was also for the first time that hospitals were asked to keep bodies of dead protesters connected to life support machines so police could pretend they were still alive and did not have to report them as having succumbed to their injuries. This practice was perfected in 2010, where the death count was so high that authorities wanted to release the news of killing incrementally. 2010 began with the cold-blooded killings of 13-year-old Wamid Farooq, a 13-year-old boy who was playing cricket near his house when a tear gas shell fired from close range broke his skull. Only 2 weeks later, a 16-year-old boy, Zahid Farooq, was standing at the roadside talking to his friends when a BSF jeep stopped and one of the soldiers got out and shot him in the head for no reason except perhaps target practice. Because it happened right outside the CRPF headquarters at Nishat, it was captured on camera and the jeep was identified. While the soldier was transferred for, quote, using excessive force during crowd management, end quote, he was never accused of murder nor prosecuted for the barbaric act he had committed. There were no protests anywhere near. Then in May of that year, the news of the Macho fake encounter broke. At first, there was an announcement by the army that 3 Pakistani infiltrators had been killed near Machil in Kupwara district. But because the families of 3 boys who had disappeared began questioning their whereabouts, the horrible truth soon became evident. Shehzad Ahmad, Riaz Ahmad, and Mohammed Shafi of Nadihal, Rafiabad, all still in their late teens, had been lured by a local territorial army recruit to the army camp at Machil near Kalarus with the promise of a few days of labor for good pay. After the boys were delivered to the commanding officer of the camp, they were shot in their faces, dressed in militant attire, and quickly buried after some photos had been taken. Because the families cried foul, the bodies were exhumed and identified as the local boys who had gone missing. Earlier, the major commanding the camp had received his orders to be rotated out of Kashmir and wanted to earn one more monetary award and promotion for killing militants before being transferred. While the army did not deny what had happened, the case was not tried before a civilian court because of the Armed Forces Special Powers Act. All of the culprits were released on bail from a military jail shortly after Modi assumed power. For me, this was an earth-shattering event. I had lived in Rafiabad for a year to work with timber smugglers and knew 2 of the 3 boys and their families very well. I still have nightmares about what happened to them. From the day it happened until I was made to leave Kashmir, I never stopped pursuing the prosecution of the killers wherever and whenever I could. This gruesome fake encounter and the subsequent killing of teenager Tufel Matu, who was on his way home from tuition when a tear gas shell almost decapitated him, were of course the triggers for the 2010 uprising, when all in all more than 140 boys died while protesting for justice and against the Indian occupation. It was also when we lived through a 4-month-long continuous curfew that was so severe that anybody attempting to break through it was shot at sight. Every evening during that time, we did nothing but count the dead. By then, social media had begun to be used widely in the valley, and we all talked to each other that way. The agencies had no idea about it and how much we were all coordinating and sharing information. Following 2010, protests became routine, and especially after prayers on Fridays. Scores of young boys were arrested on a regular basis and only set free after their families paid huge bribes to the police. Many of the young boys were tortured and humiliated while in custody. This is also the time when many local boys began joining militant groups because of the treatment they had received. Much of this was inspired by Burhan Wani and his friends, who reminded people that armed resistance against a brutal occupation was not only sanctioned by the UN Charter, but also one way to fight back after all political initiatives had failed. Most of them are dead now. Many never fired a gun. When Manan Wani was killed, we cried for days. I will stop here now because I'm sure you are exhausted from the details. But I do think it is extremely important to go beyond statistics and remember individual victims who have been killed under the most brutal circumstances and continue to be eliminated every day, even now. As I said in the beginning, tragedy is individual, and just as reading the diary of Anne Frank finally made me understand the meaning of the collective guilt of Germans, I think the world must be made to remember all these boys and young men who died without any fault of their own, and because India does not consider Kashmiris human beings worth protecting. In Kashmir, graves are full of not only unidentified bodies, but of those many of us have known and cared about and will always miss. If I may, I would like to conclude this with part of another piece I had written at that time. Yesterday, I was sitting near the river under the darkest of curfews, listening to the wailing voices of funeral singers and distant gunshots, mourning the death of boys I have never known and will never be able to befriend, and longing to sit at the lake again, in the darkness of the night where truth can be so easily hidden from someone's view. The sky was laden with dark clouds, and rain was falling on the graveyards of the old city where the dead were being buried. Yesterday, it seemed the sky over Kashmir would never clear again, and light and sunshine had now permanently vanished from my portrait of the valley. It was a picture of a place that people who have always lived here have accepted as reality painting, but that I have yet to become emotionally equipped to hang on my wall. I thought of the people I have met, the respect I have for those who have been struggling against darkness for so long, the families who have been reduced to tears, and the complete powerless one feels in the face of unstoppable human tragedy. I wanted to reach out and say to people to please still believe in the faint illusion of
Hello, Karen, you there? Karen? Hello? Karen, you still there? We could not hear you. Hello? I think there is some problem with her connection. This was Karen. Karen took us to her memories in Kashmir and to different fake encounters and the series of uprisings that were happening in Kashmir during her time when she was in Kashmir. Our eyewitness account of the happenings at different places. This should be an eye-opener. This is not a hearsay that anybody said this or reported this. This is someone who has witnessed this on ground, and like Naeem Ahmed Mahjood, Irshad and Seher, who are there, and Todd, who has been working with the people of Kashmir on the in Azad Kashmir at the borders of Azad Kashmir and in occupied Kashmir. He has seen all this happening over here. So now I think world should come to realize this. We have been joined by Claire Bidwell. Are you there, Claire? Yeah, she's an human rights activist from England, Scotland. Claire joined us late. Here you have the floor, but be brief as we are about to conclude. So floor is yours.
Good afternoon, thank you. Yeah, I mean, what an honour to follow Carrie there. I was nearly in tears before I even got to my speech. So I liked her links there with the being the, you know, the ordinary person's story, not all the statistics, you know, to be able for her to bear her heart and share that. And I think for me, you know, this title today of this meeting, The Agony of Kashmiris, I think is indeed a really fitting title. And because we're talking about the common people of the world here, I think that agony goes beyond the Kashmiris, the Kashmiri diaspora, and to people where Carrie talked there about the collective consciousness of people, and that we're all here as human beings, you know, trying to make the world peaceful, make it a better place. And, you know, it is agonizing that the Kashmiris are suffering in the way that there is suffering, in the exact way that she described there. Now, I haven't, because I've arrived late, I haven't heard the speaker, so I apologize if I repeat anything, but I guess because lots been discussed, I can be brief. So, I mean, I'm in Scotland and I've become aware of the Kashmir issue after hearing about the lockdown in August the 5th, 2019. And on a very basic human level, I couldn't believe what I was hearing. So again, in some ways, I can't believe that here we are celebrating, marking 72 years of international human rights when we have the tragedy of Kashmir on our hands. The UK government essentially divvying the land up, dividing it, walking it away, and then leaving these horrendous crimes since then. India, you know, the way they've gone in and just monopolized the evidence and the research, and, you know, the stories we've just heard there of the abuses, the crimes, you know, the mass rapes, the torture, that's all there. I mean, we've been hearing over the last couple of days, haven't we, of about a 15-year-old ring set up by India that's infiltrated internationally, where they've exposed their fake stories, spreading their lies. So those links there with Nazism and Germany, and a collective consciousness of the world, where we need to start standing up and making this as a big issue. I mean, you know, to support the Kashmiris and link together. And so for me, my work comes at this from a common person perspective. And I've essentially been trying to create links with as many people as I can across the Kashmiri diaspora and Kashmiris to raise their voices louder where they've been stopped from tweeting on Facebook, even in the streets, the reporters silenced, everything, those voices. It's getting worse since the lockdown. In many ways, the situation's getting worse. And with COVID, the lockdown within a lockdown, and the economy and people are continuing to suffer, and not enough is being done for them on the outside with regards to our world leaders and the, you know, the UN resolutions and human rights articles and charters. They're not being met. So for me, with all this, you know, I look at where we've been, you know, what's brought us to this stage and where are we now and what is it that we can do about it. So we've learned a lot, you know, and I think it's looking at the Kashmiris working together, seeking their unity. I think self-determination is the one thing that can draw everybody together and bind everybody together. So, you know, I'm hoping within my work to build those strengths, take those links forward, and put in, you know, the people, putting the pressure on our governments, looking for the support from the human rights organizations, all the people with positions of power and in the United Nations that can help us to achieve that, get a humanitarian envoy aid into Indian occupied Kashmir. Really, it needs to be highlighted, you know, human rights needs to be put over economy, and everybody, as much as we can everywhere, needs to speak up and make this a united effort. And we have to keep bashing through. And just as Carrie finished in there, is having that belief that we can be successful here, that we can achieve this. Sometimes, you know, that agony transpires into the agony of nothing ever fixed, nothing ever getting solved. And so the fight for self-determination, by exposing all the human rights atrocities and crimes that have occurred, you know, and exposing Modi and the Indian BJP government and the effects that he's having, you know, not only on Kashmir, but with his own country. We can all see, you know, that he's exposing himself, as it were. So I don't know, I just Yeah, I mean, it's beyond belief, to be honest. I can't sometimes believe that this is actually happening. It's pure evil. And there's a simple solution, and that's the United Nations to send in their peacekeeping army. The ceasefire line, where is that a ceasefire? The brutalities on the border are just, again, I can't understand that this goes on. Sometimes I cannot get my head around it. And so to put an end to all those atrocities, you know, it's urging people, the United Nations, to get in there with their peacekeeping army and give Kashmiris their right for self-determination. And we would see so much suffering and pain and agony eased. And so, yeah, it's quite, it's 72 years of human rights, and this is what we're facing today. And we know it's not just within Kashmir, it's a global issue. And if we could look at the mechanics that it needs to take to solve the Kashmir issue, then hopefully we could see a different world and see the mechanics, you know, raise out elsewhere. So keeping it brief and stopping there, really. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for your intervention. You rightly said that Kashmiri diaspora needs to work together and in conformity with the right to self-determination should be their main goal, and to create structures in the overseas and make friends, and so that civil society and the governments can be pressurized to know more about Kashmir and to come to the rescue of people of Kashmir. When we were, the world is marking the International Human Rights Day, we made this effort. And while we were talking, I came to know that 3 journalists in Kashmir, they were beaten, they were harassed today because they went to interview a DDC candidate who was contesting an election in Shopian, and he was not allowed to vote. That is what they say, democratic process. A candidate was not allowed to vote. When he tried to interact with a journalist, those journalists were beaten, they were thrashed, they were harassed, and some of them have been injured also. So this is a situation which is happening in Kashmir. I think all of you made wonderful contributions, from young Irshad to Sir and our senior Naima Mahajur, made you know about the history of Kashmir, the situation in Kashmir and the happenings in Kashmir. And all you, as Todd said, that he has no hope with the American government and all that, but still we believe that people at large in the international community, their conscience will waken up and they will come to the rescue of people of Kashmir. If anybody wants to add something, so he or she may.
Can I?
Yes, sir.
So I would like to just quote one thing my father had said, that he had written when in a press conference. He said this in an interview, that they changed our beautiful meadows into our graveyards. They colored our sweet watered lakes with our blood. But remember, oppression strengthens the power of resistance. They have to let us free. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Anybody else? Irshad, can you add something?
Also, please, it's requested to all of you to stay in touch, because we all have a very, very, very nice goal, very important goal. So,
Surely. Irshad? Yeah, Todd, please.
Well, everybody has brought such an amazing experience and point of view. I agree that we have to try to wake the world's consciousness, the people of the world who are either unaware or don't get it, or have been brainwashed or misguided. I still have a little bit of hope for humanity left, and I hope that that all of us can somehow manage to wake that conscience of the world up, so that we can overcome the machinations of the psychopathic rulers of this world that we're having to deal with right now, that aren't doing anything about this except making it worse. And I pray for all of you and your success, and I hope to meet you again or see you sometime in the future whenever possible.
Thank you. Irshad. Irshad?
Someone with the hand raised. Probably someone from our speakers want to ask us something.
Irshad, you there?
Yeah, I'm here. Thank you very much for providing us a favorable chance today, because it was a very much informative session, and I believe that in future such workshops and such interactive sessions will be held under the banner of Kashmir Institute of International Relations. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Irshad. Naima ji, would you like to add something?
Yeah, 2 points, quick 2 points. One, unless and until we have got some media platforms to say whatever we want to say and to engage with the people, no, like Ted was saying that the people here don't know, we have to make them know. We have to tell them the stories of the Kashmir, which are totally hidden. For that, we need social platform and we need media platforms to work with us. And the second thing is, which Claire was saying, that all this diaspora, because there are so many organizations, so many, different groups, everybody is working and we, appreciate their efforts. But I would like if they all come together and have a united one platform, so that it can become a strong platform to make your voice and to engage with the different parliamentarians, senators, governments, and the opinion makers. And that could make, some sense to meet those who can be influenced, who can just put pressure on the Indian government to get relief for the people of Kashmir. Thank you.
Yeah, wonderful. So Daniela, do you want to add something?
Sure. I guess I just want to say to conclude that I know so many of us come at the Kashmir conflict with varying perspectives and experiences, can be on different sides of the spectrum, and sometimes that can create a lot of divisiveness. And I just think that we all need to remember, and to those that we work with as activists, that we all have a commonality here to free Kashmir, to end the human rights abuses in Kashmir. And we have to remember that first and foremost as we address these issues. And we have strength in numbers, and so we really need to find that unity to address the cause. Thank you.
Thank you. Mariana, you want to add something?
I would like just to say that we share the same goal. So I share the idea of Sarah to keep in touch and to keep on working together in order to stop those violations. And as Todd previously said, many governments and many journalists and media do not properly talk about Kashmiri issues. So we should keep on spreading the information about Kashmir and showing this goal of ending human rights violations. Thank you.
I thank you all for your contribution, your suggestions, and I hope that we can make these suggestions a practical one and work together in future, as we have not lost the hope. As someone has said, that hope is an incurable disease, and we will live with this incurable disease till we achieve our goal. Thank you all once again for your contributions. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.